Neoteny.
Hi everyone, and for those of you who are wondering what the hell that was all about, allow me to explain the basics. Neoteny is an evolutionary phenomenon in which the features of the infants or juveniles of a given species' ancestors manifest in the phenotypes of sexually mature adults of the descendant species. And yeah, that's a bit of verbiage to work out, so I'm going to take a stab at breaking it all down. Now, back in the day, our ancestors, the adults, looked kind of like this. And the babies of our ancestors looked mostly like this. And no, those weren't pictures of our hominid ancestors. They're actually pictures of chimpanzees. But for the purpose of this discussion, they provide a suitable stand-in for what we would have looked like a couple of million years ago. And the interesting thing is that when you compare skulls, the skulls of modern humans in adulthood more closely resemble the skulls of the infant chimpanzees than the adult ones. Now, this phenomenon applies to both men and women. Human beings are a very neotenous species. For those of you who haven't been stalking me online or listening to me on the radio, I've actually been thinking and talking a fair bit about neoteny recently in the context of society's views of gender and what I've sort of begun to characterize as innate or biological sexism. Now, humans of both sexes actually display a lot of neoteny compared to our closest primate relatives, including the size of our brains relative to our bodies. In fact, our evolutionary tendency toward neoteny has been posited by some experts as a potential explanation as to how we grew these huge things of ours in the first place. That's because prolonging maturation results in neoteny. It extends the periods of development we go through as we grow from babies to adults, prolonging various developmental periods and essentially postponing deadlines. And deadlines are important. For instance, the deadline for developing the capacity for language. Language is just enormously complex, and it requires a lot of neural hardware to be built and then selectively pruned and fine-tuned and adjusted, both before and during its acquisition. And yeah, there is a deadline for that if a human being hasn't built the necessary brain structures by about age 6. They'll almost never be able to integrate all the elements of speaking and understanding language. Things like grammar, vocabulary, syntax, all of which interact in order to express and understand complex ideas through words. They may be able to pick up words, as in vocabulary, but they won't be able to put it all together and derive complex meaning out of it. Now, building that kind of hardware in a human brain takes time, and it takes a lot of stimulation and a lot of caloric input. And contrary to what my or your kids might wish, sexual maturity is not the same as intellectual, emotional, or even physical maturity. Our brains don't stop developing until we're in our early to mid-20s, even though we can reproduce about a decade prior to that. Like any other species, human beings have the capacity to trend back and forth throughout our evolution between neoteny and what's called acceleration, which is neoteny's opposite, depending on environmental factors and selection pressures. We have, however, displayed a general trend over time toward greater and greater neoteny. Now, why is this important? Well, a few reasons. The first is that neoteny is influenced in large part by sexual selection, and sexual selection is influenced by selection pressures that exist in the environment, including social pressures. If evolutionary pressures for our ancestors had been such that humans with shorter periods of maturation and more condensed developmental periods with earlier deadlines were better at surviving, well, we might be a lot more like chimpanzees than the super intelligent, if silly, species that we are. Now, we share about 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, and yet at the same time we reach sexual maturity years later than they do, and other developmental milestones like tooth eruption are significantly delayed in humans compared to chimps. More importantly, genes that are active in the brain at different stages of development switch on and off at earlier ages in chimpanzees than they do in humans. So basically, the gist of all of this is that when a species has to grow up fast in order to survive, there's just less time to get smart. So, what made it possible for our hominid ancestors to postpone the onset of physical maturity and independent adulthood in the kind of survivalist environment we used to live in? An environment that's really not that different from the one that, say, chimpanzees live in now. What conditions led to humans being able to extend our childhoods in this way? Now, I want to make it clear from this point on that a lot of what's going to follow is just my conjecture based on my examination of a whole bunch of stuff. So take it as you will, and if you have any criticisms or anything you'd like to add, please do so in the comments. It's my speculation that the monogamous egalitarian model of social organization would have potentially provided these conditions to early humans. In my earlier video on benevolent sexism, I talked about an evolutionary biologist's recent findings regarding how our species transition from the tournament model of social organization toward monogamy went down. He demonstrated by a mathematical model how our early hominid grandmothers may have cheated the existing tournament system by rewarding more cooperative males with a shot at reproducing. This is a behavior that's also been observed in other primates like baboons. Now, according to his theory, the female tendency to exercise this particular sexual choice became more common over generations as female preference for gentler, nicer, more cooperative, and investment-oriented males was passed down to more and more descendants. In other words, the offspring of females who opted for good fathers outcompeted the offspring of those who prioritized the bestest genes. But would paternal investment alone have been enough to trend us in the direction of neoteny and these gigantic brains of ours? Well, if it was, then marmosets might be a lot better at math than they are, because marmoset dads are actually more nurturing and investment-oriented than marmoset moms. Now, most monogamous species who live in groups have some fairly hard and fast rules as to who gets to reproduce. Taking the example of those marmosets, these guys generally live in extended family groups of 9 to 15 adults, a mating pair, and lots of their adult kids, and maybe their parents, who all help to raise the offspring of the mating pair. And the mating pair will actually aggressively police the other adults in their group to prevent them from mating, to prevent them from reproducing themselves, in order to protect the investment of the extended family members in their own young. So with only one pair reproducing, you kind of need to churn out a lot of kids to keep the population large and stable enough to sustain itself. And frankly, popping out twins twice a year means those babies have to grow up fast, even when you have lots of help to raise them. And I do mean fast. Marmosets grow from infancy to full adulthood in the space of 15 months. Now, while early humans also lived in cooperative groups that usually included extended family members, the fact that reproduction was not limited to just a few individuals, that's a big deal, and that doesn't tend to happen in the natural world in social species. Then you combine that with the increasing levels of individual paternal investment in offspring and the added cooperation and assistance of extended family, and you've basically set the conditions for individuals to be able to remain children for far longer than even our closest primate relatives. So, in my opinion, it's the egalitarian part of the monogamous egalitarian model that's what generated the conditions that were necessary for us to be able to extend our childhoods in this way. So really, it's been the form of social organization that we've existed under for millennia that allowed us to become human beings. And this is why I think it's just if we went back and changed history changed our social organization, removed patriarchy, we might be something completely different from what we are now. Now, the second reason neoteny is important in the gender debate is that neoteny manifests to different degrees in men and women, and it affects behavior. Experiments with wild Russian foxes found that by selectively breeding the most physically or behaviorally neotenous individuals, one could not only affect the physical attributes of adults within only a few generations, things like pointy ears turning floppy in adulthood, but you could essentially alter their behavioral traits as well. Over generations of selective breeding, the neotenous foxes became more friendly, more curious, playful, affectionate, and cooperative. They not only retained the physical features of the juveniles of previous generations, but some of their personality and behavioral features as well. And the reproductive cycle was even altered. And not only does neoteny affect personality and behavioral traits, it also affects how people perceive other individuals. So, what does this all have to do with gender and innate sexism?
At all these cute little guys, they're so nice, they're so sweet, they would never bite me or hurt me, and I just want to hug them and take care of them and just be nice to them and feed them and... Ah! Maybe not!
Neoteny has its upsides and its downsides, and what's an upside for one sex can very easily be a downside for the other. More than that, what's an upside in one environment or situation may be a downside in a different environment or situation. Now, one upside of neoteny is that the more neotenous an individual is, the more they are likely to bring out the protection and provisioning instincts of others. Neotenous animals, like those babies that I just showed you, they make you want to be nice to them, or at least not be mean to them. And the same goes for neoteny in women. In fact, women are way more neotenous than men, both in appearance and in behavior and personality. Emotional expressiveness, for instance, is a neotenous trait. I know how it gets framed in the gender debate as emotional maturity or being emotionally gifted, but really it is a form of neoteny. It's a form of childlike behavior. And crying is the big one that gets talked about a lot in MRM circles. And when it's discussed there, it's usually discussed within the context of it being an emotional manipulation. But as far as I'm concerned, it's a biological feature of women. Crying as a neotenous behavioral trait, rather than simply a cynical manipulation, is supported by the fact that women have more productive tear glands and narrower tear ducts than men do. Yep, you heard me. Women evolved to be criers. Men, on the other hand, have less productive tear glands and larger tear ducts. Their tear glands not only produce fewer tears than women, but they actually need to build more of them up before those tears are going to spill from the larger ducts. And, of course, the biologically facilitated behavior of adult women crying wouldn't be nearly as useful to them if it wasn't accompanied by the higher forehead, larger eyes, smaller mouth, shorter nose, more rounded chin, softer body, higher pitched voice, more delicate jaw, less body and facial hair. You get what I mean. And like any other sex difference, the different levels of neoteny, including the capacity to cry, is going to be related to the different evolutionary pressures on our male and female ancestors. A 1995 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that neotenous facial features in women were preferred by men across cultures, and they were perceived as embodying a higher degree of femininity and sociability. In other words, women who were cuter were perceived as being nicer, and they were more attractive to men. In contrast, the same researchers found that faces low in neoteny were perceived as intimidating. One of the aspects of neoteny I find most interesting is that people take you less seriously in some very specific contexts. They take you less seriously when you want their respect, or when you're coming at them with a knife, or when you've done something harmful or atrocious, or when you want to be seen as tough and capable and competent and self-sufficient. In other words, They take you less seriously when you are exercising adult agency or are attempting to be seen as an agent. Agents have the ability to affect themselves, others, and the environment in both positive and negative ways, and agents are held accountable for their actions. Now, we don't tend to see children as agents. Even when they're acting on others in negative ways, we don't hold them accountable the way we would an adult. We just don't take them seriously in that way. But some of the ways in which we do take children seriously is when they let us know they're hurt or upset or in danger. And when they do let us know this, we feel an impulse to remove the hurt or the upset or the danger if we can, don't we? I mean, we don't expect children to take care of and protect themselves. We expect them to let us know when they need to be taken care of and protected. And we feel all these same things about women as well. To put it bluntly, we take women very, very seriously when they are expressing themselves as objects. And we really don't take them as seriously when they're expressing themselves as agents. And for those less neotenous men, the script gets flipped on its head. We take men more seriously when they want respect, when they want to be seen as tough and competent and capable and self-sufficient, and especially when they're coming at you with a knife. On the other end, we take men far less seriously when they're expressing themselves as objects. When they tell us they're hurt or upset or in danger, when they say they need help, when they can't improvise, adapt, or overcome, we expect them to be capable of handling it like the adults we expect them to be, the adults they more closely resemble. We really don't feel a collective urge to help or comfort or protect them, and we don't get that same pain in our gut when we see someone kicking the shit out of a man the way we do when we see it happening to a woman. So why would men and women not have evolved the same degree of neoteny? Because on our evolutionary path, on the evolutionary path of any species, what works for one sex isn't necessarily going to be what works for the other. And this is why I posted that initial comment on Zom Gets Chris's video, the comment that said this: "You claim the central premise of patriarchy is men are strong, women are weak. Look a little deeper, and you may come to the assumption that is the wellspring of your assumption, one supported by men's greater strength, women's greater neoteny, all the ways men were and are disadvantaged, the expectations placed on men and women, the ways women have been restricted, even the reason people insult men by calling them women. Hint, it isn't men are strong, women are weak." The only reason neoteny could have worked for women is because of the true premise of the old system Chris and other feminists identify as the patriarchy. The central premise, which remains unchanged and is likely to remain unchanged indefinitely. The one that's buried under all of the layers of biological differences, social constructs, our gendered perceptions of men and women, and all of the political bullshit that goes along with it. Now, that central premise is this: women are valuable, men are expendable. That is the foundation of Chris's tertiary assumption. And you can reason it out by asking a very few simple questions. How does a person become strong? A person becomes strong by being subjected to stresses and hardships and all kinds of other things that test their mettle and force them to get stronger. A sex, men for instance, become strong through natural selection pressures that make strength an advantage and weakness a disadvantage. How does one become weak? A person becomes weak through being protected from stresses and hardships and all kinds of other things that test their mettle, and that allows them to be weak. A sex, women for example, becomes or remains weak through natural selection pressures that favor weakness over strength. Now, any science geek who's had his underpants pulled over his head right before being stuffed into a locker, could tell you that weakness does not translate into a survival advantage for males. Men don't get extra protection when they're weak. They just get ground into the dirt or tossed in the trash. Women do get protection when they're weak. And who do we protect? What do we protect in our society? We protect what is valuable to us. Who do we leave to fend for themselves? Those who have no value to us. It's really as simple as that. More than that, for men to have become genetically predisposed to shed more neotenous features upon adulthood than women do, selection pressures had to be such that not retaining as many neotenous features was advantageous to men's survival and reproductive success. That means that either there was no extra protection or provisioning for men when they looked and behaved like children, or it means that whatever extra protection and provision they might have gotten out of it was inadequate compensation for the disadvantages that accompanied it. For women to have evolved to become more neotenous than men must mean that they got some kind of serious advantage in exchange for being taken less seriously as agents. And that advantage is going to be extra provisioning and protection. That is, being taken seriously as an object provided women an advantage that outweighed any advantage that might lie in being seen as an agent. The fact that men across cultures see neotenous women as more sexually attractive is further evidence that for women, greater neoteny meant greater reproductive success. Men wouldn't have evolved the preference for neotenous women if non-neotenous women were better at making babies or could acquire better provisioning and protection for them. So, why the scary music at the beginning of the video? Well, I guess it's because if our sexist perceptions of men and women, the fundamental one being that women are valuable and men are expendable, are so ingrained in us, and have been for so long, as to have engendered all these physical differences between men and women, up to and including the physical capacity to cry, then it might be something we're stuck with. Especially since those physical differences evolved in concert with broader neurological and behavioral sex differences that I've talked about in the past. And that really sucks for a lot of men and women. For women, all of the assumptions, expectations, and perceptions based on their inherent value, which is what resulted in the more neotenous phenotypes that were so beneficial to their success and survival in the harsher past. Well, all of that presents a challenge for women who want to become empowered through their own agency and be taken seriously for what they can accomplish and contribute to society. It's going to be a little bit harder for them to be seen that way. And for men who, for whatever reason, find themselves in the position of being an object, unable to cope on their own with what life throws at them, men who can't exercise meaningful agency, can't overcome life's challenges, there's really no impulse on the part of society to offer them what we still offer women: compassion, help, and support. When he doesn't measure up to our expectations of him, we just drop him at the curb and try not to look at him while we wait for garbage day. And this is where I think feminism just is taking us in the absolute wrong direction. Because the focus of feminists like Amy Roth on women's feelings of discomfort, fear, and upset, and how the world must change to accommodate them, that isn't going to do anything to make women stronger, not as individuals, not as a sex, or to make them be taken more seriously. If anything, it's more infantilizing than anything women were ever subjected to under the dreaded patriarchy. I mean, how on earth can you take someone seriously who bursts into tears over a freaking t-shirt and then unashamedly exploits their own weakness online in order to get power and attention and all the goodies? You know, you can't make someone stronger by demanding that all their weaknesses be indulged or assisted with. And Honestly, if you never allow that men can have serious problems with sexist assumptions, a lot of them bigger and more harmful to individual men than any that women face. If you cannot share society's compassion, that means you're not willing to give up your object status. Because we don't feel compassion for agents. We hold them accountable. We hold them responsible for themselves and their behavior. We hold them responsible for protecting themselves, for being self-sufficient. And feminists like Amy Roth, who basically throw a tantrum and then go tell and demand that others help her, and demand that others feel compassion for her, and demand that others sympathize with her, they're not doing anything to help women be taken seriously as agents, as adults. When you act like a child, people see you as a child. So, honestly, I think if feminism really wants women to be seen as equals and women to be taken seriously as being competent and self-sufficient and capable and in charge of their lives, then the best thing that they could do is let men be victims once in a while. Let men be bigger victims than women are in some cases where it's appropriate, right? Portray them as such. Stop yelling, "What about the men's?" But that is a complaint for another day, I guess. Anyhow, those are my views of Neoteny and how I think we came to be the way we are, and why I feel that some of what we are dealing with as a society, some of this sexism against both sides, is really something that we may be stuck with, because everything seems to feed into it. You have these sort of biological and psychological paths of least resistance, and we want to go that way. And the more we go that way, the more worn down that path gets, and it turns into a rut, and then there's no getting out. And I think feminism is just taking us further down that road, and I hate to see that. I really do. So anyhow, that's it for me for today. Feel free to leave any comments or questions or criticisms way down there. And as always, I will leave links to some of my information in the low bar. So that's it for me for now. I will see you all later.